So today I want to talk about a webinar or a seminar flow. The difference between a webinar and a seminar being that a webinar is going to happen online, whereas a seminar typically will happen in person, potentially at your office or place of business. Now, these webinars can be very, very, very powerful. They do require quite a bit of preparation to actually deliver the webinar, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. But they're so powerful that Russell Brunson, the founder of ClickFunnels, has credited the growth of ClickFunnels from an unknown company to a $100 million company, having happened on the back of predominantly their webinar flows and webinar funnels. Either way, we certainly are living in a time when people are sharing lots of knowledge and information. And for most any business, you've got some level of expertise, which is in fact the bedrock of the value that you're providing and that people are ultimately paying for so that you can solve some problem that they want you to solve. And webinars are a great way for you to be able to collate or aggregate people in order to share some of the knowledge that you may have and that you want to then move people towards. A webinar flow is very similar in structure to the other flows that we've explored before, for instance, the squeeze page or the video sales letter / reverse squeeze page flow. And so a lot of the components will look and feel very similar. There are some different ways that we can extend them, however, and I'll go through that momentarily. So when we start with the webinar, we start with as with many of the other flows, we start with our landing page. And a webinar landing page is going to be slightly different than traditional squeeze page. If you remember, the squeeze page was really just about a headline and curiosity, and then you were going to get and then you got some email information, let's say, in order to then deliver some form of small lead magnet, or even maybe an article that was that's particularly valuable and that the curiosity was enough to propel someone in. For a webinar, you are looking to do a couple of different things. One, you want to be able to share some excitement around what this person is going to be receiving, but because what they're going to be trading in addition to their email address is their time, you want to make sure that it's really clear what they're going to be getting in exchange for this time, because time is a very, very valuable resource, perhaps the most valuable resource. It is, after all, the one resource that we can never get back. Right? We can always make more money, we cannot make more time. So when we start with our webinar example, we're really going to make sure that, as with other flows and funnels, we are prioritizing a really interesting, curiosity-arousing headline that promises to deliver. Instead of then kind of doing a quick pitch here, though, we might have a subheader that takes it a little bit further in order to really kind of tweak that curiosity just a little bit more. But above the fold, you're really just trying to grab attention and get someone to maybe scroll a little bit to be able to see what they're going to be getting for this hour of their time that they're going to exchange in addition to their email address. Of course, on a webinar page or a seminar page, you want to make sure that you have the date and time of the presentation so someone knows when it is, so they know when to show up. And you also generally want to add your name or the presenter's name, as well as maybe the title and any bona fides that they have, in order to demonstrate that you are in fact an expert in the industry that you are pitching the webinar. The meat of the webinar and the webinar landing page is ultimately going to be what the person will get in exchange for their time. Typically, there will be no more than 3 points in the course of the webinar, and these webinars can run anywhere from, let's call it 45 minutes to an hour and a half. Probably more than that is a little bit overkill. And certainly you should expect that the longer the webinar is, perhaps the less or the fewer conversions you get, unless the topic is really, really compelling to the audience that you are sharing this with. So what are these? So what is the meat of your webinar going to be? And at some point, we'll do a whole podcast on this. And certainly, I suggest you check out perfectwebinarsecrets.com. This is Russell Brunson's ClickFunnels training on how to deliver webinars. And to my knowledge, there isn't a better resource, at least one that I've found, that I think goes into how to build a webinar better than that. But at a high level, with the webinar, you really want to focus on no more than 3 main points that somebody's going to walk away with. Now, there is also, with the webinar, a tendency to keep it really focused on the education component. Remember, this is part of a funnel and a lead flow designed to move somebody to being a customer or a qualified lead. And so in your presentation, you want to make sure that you're not just educating and that these 3 points aren't just 3 interesting or compelling points, but rather you're moving somebody from a place where they don't know much to a place where they know something that they can go and implement themselves, but also recognize that perhaps it would be better for them to just hire you in order to be able to really accomplish the goal that they want to accomplish. Generally speaking, more than 3 strategies is going to be overwhelming. People will not remember that much information. And also it means you've got to spend more time putting content together. And any communication expert, if you read any of the work of, say, Nancy Duarte or any of those others, will tell you that more than 3 bullets is probably too many. And again, there's a whole lot that can be said about presentations. The framework that Russell talks about in his Perfect Webinar Secrets training that I think is particularly compelling is to map each of these 3 strategies to the 3 main objections people might have to purchasing your product or service. And those typical objectives are typically going to be one of 3 things. The first is what he calls the vehicle, which is that will this particular product or service accomplish the goal? Do I believe that the product or service can accomplish whatever the goal is that I'm trying to accomplish? The second is what are called internal objections, which is that I believe that the product or service can in fact accomplish a particular goal or objective, but I'm not sure it'll work for me for any number of circumstances. Maybe I don't have the skill set required to implement the particular thing, or maybe I don't have the right kind of home or foundation or whatever, that kind of thing. So what are the things about me that I might look at and say, there's reasons that I can't accomplish this using this strategy? And that's the second set of objections. Third set of objections are what are called external barriers or external objections. And these are excuses people make that are outside of themselves. So I believe the vehicle can work, or that this service can accomplish a goal. I believe that I have the internal resources, but maybe I don't have the right external resources. Maybe I feel like I don't have enough time, or maybe I don't, I need to coordinate with too many other people, or maybe I need to ask a partner. So there's any number of reasons that somebody might point to outside of themselves that might prevent them from being able to feel comfortable essentially agreeing to your product or service. And these 3 strategies should both be educational, but also attenuated with or tending to address these objections, so that at the end of the webinar, people understand that the vehicle works for them. They understand what the internal objections are and have thought through them, or at least have a mechanism for thinking through them and overcoming them. And they've thought through the external objections and are at least clear to what they are and can overcome them. And again, there's a whole lot more to be said about how to construct a webinar, but when we're putting together the landing page for a webinar, these are some of the main issues, or some of the main things we want to make sure that we are putting on there and communicating/conveying. So compelling headline and subheader, the date and time, presenter bona fides, or is it bona fides? I think it's bona fides. And then the 3 strategies that somebody will learn from the particular webinar. Now, lots of ways to extend this template. One obvious way to extend it is to have testimonials or logo banners reinforcing social proof. In fact, social proof as a principle is almost always a good thing to have on a site if you can. Urgency with a registration timer or countdown, or scarcity. And there's a distinction between urgency and scarcity. Urgency is time bound, scarcity is quantity or inventory bound. So you might say, okay, we want to add some urgency. This webinar registration closes in 3 days, and you might add some scarcity, saying that we've only got 10 or 20 seats. And again, if it's a seminar, you're going to have probably fewer seats, right? So you might only have 10 or 12 seats, especially if in these COVID times you're social distancing, and depending on the size of your office, you might have a scarce number of seats available in real life. Okay. Now, you also might want to add a paragraph with the presenter's bio. Maybe you want to limit or restrict replays, so that somebody who registers can only get access to the replay after, for 24 hours, and then after that it's gone, in order to prevent the problem of shrinkage. And this, by the way, is an issue with webinars in general. you should expect that the number of people who sign up and the number of people who show up is going to be slightly less than half. And so, again, it can vary tremendously based on the quality of your offer, the quality of your follow-up sequence. So there's a lot of things, but as a rule of thumb, you should expect some shrinkage between the people who choose to register and then people who ultimately show up. And another way to boost this template would be to request phone numbers for text reminders, because one of the biggest problems that you're going to run into is the one I just said, which is getting people to show up. So for a webinar sequence, similar to any of the other sequences we've discussed, you want to obviously put the lead data into your email list. You want to send a responder confirming webinar registration. But for a webinar, you absolutely need a nurture sequence. If you recall in previous conversations about these things, I've said, the nurture sequence could be optional. It's a best practice, but it is optional. For a webinar, I would be hard pressed to call it optional. And your nurture sequence should be not only the webinar registration, but also the reminders that the webinar is coming up. And you might set those reminders up 24 hours in advance, an hour in advance, 5 minutes before. And these are all just to nurture people, to remind them, hey, you signed up for this thing, you made this commitment, and now please show up. To that end, one of there is a psychological bias that we all have towards honoring commitments. And so a couple of things that you can do to help reinforce that bias. One is through the nurture sequence itself. So reminding people, hey, you showed up, or just having it. So that itself is that in and of itself is enough to remind people that they made a commitment. But even the language in that email, hey, you signed up for this thing. Really, really looking forward to being able to share this kind of thing with you. I know you're the kind of person who honors commitments and wants to make your business better. So subtle copywriting inside of those emails can really start to reinforce that bias somebody generally has to be in integrity with themselves and not to break that commitment. But you should still expect some shrinkage. And things come up, things will happen, and then people just oftentimes they forget or they just don't want to show up. Something comes up. You guys are in business yourselves. You know how things go. You don't always honor the commitments you make when it comes to scheduling things like a virtual webinar. So adding some of those things like urgency, scarcity, and some pressure reduces the probability of that happening, but it does not eliminate it altogether. Thank you page we've talked about before in other podcasts. So the thank you page itself, a quick short thank you that lets people know, hey, check your email for the webinar registration information. You're in, and then maybe ascend somebody to the next step in the value or product ladder. Now, what components, as I mentioned before, so there are a couple of components. So just to summarize, you want to make sure you've got a curiosity-arousing headline, certainly compelling subheaders, your really compelling webinar content with around 3 strategies, no more than 3 strategies really, that someone can learn, but also leads to a purchase decision. Because at the end of the webinar, you want to have a compelling offer and call to action that you can sell at the end of the webinar and into the post-webinar. Remember, you are giving away this information not just because you're a good person and these things work, they do, but also because you're expecting and hoping that in the process of doing this, you will ultimately get a new customer or at least a new, really, really highly qualified lead. Offer appropriate images, strategy appropriate images for the strategies 1, 2, and 3. If you're doing this online, you will need webinar software like Zoom or GoToWebinar or Webinar Jam. There are lots of other ones. You could even use Google Meet if you wanted to, but you do need some mechanism that allows you to deliver the webinar. And different webinar softwares have different benefits, right? So, and again, that is outside the scope of our conversation, but something to look into if you decide to use a webinar. We have Webinar Jam, I think, because it was relatively affordable and we like the features just fine, though we don't use it as much as we should. We could use Zoom just as easily, I think. Email service provider, email to, as well as emails to deliver your webinar registration. I should change that. And your webinar nurture campaign. So those are the main components that you'll need in order to make your webinar successful. So hopefully you found this interesting and helpful for your business. Now these webinars are going to be especially useful for anybody who's in a service industry, someone who's got knowledge to share. But it could also be adapted to other kinds of industries. And in fact, there is a woman, I believe her name is Jamie Cross, that uh, adapted it to selling soap. So you can use webinars in different ways, but they will work better in some industries than others, as will most of these other kinds of funnels. And so um, webinars for things like opportunities, for services, for any kind of knowledge exchange can be a really, really powerful way to start to build up your lead list and build up your customer base. For more product or transactional types businesses, it may not be the right strategy for you. So anyways, hope you found this helpful. If you did, please take a second to like and subscribe. Or if you know somebody else who would find this useful, please take a minute and do them a favor and us a favor and share it with them. And we will talk to you later. Thank you.